April 11th, 1951. In the middle of a grinding war in Korea, the President of the United States makes a choice that could cost him his job. Harry Truman fires his most famous general. On the other side of the world, in Tokyo, that decision reaches General Douglas MacArthur in the most humiliating way possible. He is halfway through a formal lunch at the American embassy with Senator Warren Magnuson when an aide slips out to answer a radio in the next room. A commercial news bulletin cuts through the static and announces that Douglas MacArthur has been relieved of all his commands in the Far East. Within minutes, the same headline is on Japanese stations. Staff move quickly through the corridors. MacArthur's wife, Jean, is told first. Then she leans across the table and quietly passes the news to her husband. The official telegram from Washington will not arrive for another half hour. By the time the paper order reaches his headquarters, the general has already learned from a broadcaster that his career at the top of the American military is over. Truman is already unpopular. MacArthur is treated as a hero in much of the country, and members of Congress are talking about investigations and even impeachment. What MacArthur said after he was fired, and how Truman defended that decision, would turn a fight over strategy into a public test of who really controlled how America fights its wars. To understand why that moment was so explosive, you have to see who MacArthur had become by 1951. Almost 2 decades earlier, in 1932, Americans had already seen him push hard against the edges of civilian control. When desperate First World War veterans, the so-called bonus army, camped in Washington to demand early payment of their promised bonuses, President Herbert Hoover ordered federal troops to clear government buildings. MacArthur, then Army Chief of Staff, directed a larger operation. Under his command, troops drove the veterans out of central Washington, crossed the Anacostia River, and destroyed the main encampment with fire, while some officials in the administration later said they had wanted a more limited action. Photographs of United States soldiers advancing with bayonets and tanks against their own veterans appeared in newspapers across the country. To some in Washington, the lessons seemed clear. Here was a brilliant and driven officer who had a habit, in their view, of interpreting instructions in his own way, and sometimes carrying them further than elected leaders intended. Before we continue, please like the video and hit subscribe for more deep dives into our history. In the Second World War, that same boldness helped build his legend. MacArthur commanded Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, planned risky amphibious landings, and became the public face of the American return to the Philippines. When Japan surrendered, he moved to Tokyo as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. In that role, he was not just another general. In practice, he was the central authority of the occupation. Under his direction, his staff produced a draft of a new Japanese constitution in a matter of days, which the Japanese Diet then revised and adopted in 1946. MacArthur argued that Emperor Hirohito should remain on the throne, and he pressed that case to Washington on the grounds that the emperor's cooperation was essential to maintain order and carry out reforms. Land reform, women's suffrage, labor rights, and demilitarization were all introduced through a Japanese government that continued to exist formally but operated under his oversight. For nearly 6 years, he lived in Tokyo, traveled through streets where many people treated him with a kind of shogun-like deference, and signed orders that reshaped Japanese political and social life. It is widely noted that few American officers, before or since, have exercised that degree of practical civilian power while still in uniform. Harry Truman watched this from Washington with mixed feelings, at least as his diary and later recollections suggest. In private, he wrote about MacArthur in very sharp terms and contrasted him with more self-effacing commanders such as Eisenhower and Bradley, whom he saw as steadier team players. On paper, though, Truman and MacArthur still needed each other. Truman was the president who had inherited a world war and then the Cold War. MacArthur was the victorious general who had overseen the occupation of Japan and, in much of the American public's imagination, stood as the main symbol of United States power in Asia. As the Cold War hardened, Truman became more wary. He knew that MacArthur had already clashed with the president during the bonus army crisis. He saw the general dominate headlines from Tokyo. He heard reports of MacArthur's growing political support among conservatives at home. By 1950, as the Korean peninsula slid toward war, Truman was no longer dealing only with a theater commander. He was dealing with a figure many Americans already discussed as a potential alternative national leader. In his notes in early April 1951, Truman no longer described MacArthur simply as a military problem in the Far East. He wrote that the situation around his Far Eastern general had become a political question. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, MacArthur was given command of United Nations forces in Korea. At first, the war was a desperate defensive stand around Pusan. Then came a spectacular reversal with the Incheon landing. Then another crisis as Chinese forces crossed the Yalu River in strength. By late 1950, the United States faced a hard question. Was Korea to be held as a limited police action, or was it the opening front of a much wider confrontation with communism in Asia? Truman and his civilian advisors settled on a limited war. They wanted to restore a defensible line in Korea, avoid direct war with the People's Republic of China, and above all, prevent any sequence of events that might trigger a global conflict with the Soviet Union, which already had atomic weapons. MacArthur's view was very different. He argued that a war which did not aim at decisive victory was a war being lost slowly. In private discussions, and later in public comments, he pressed for authority to bomb bases in Manchuria, to blockade the Chinese coast, and to bring nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan into the fight. He did not publicly call for immediate nuclear strikes, but he took part in discussions and contingency planning that assumed atomic weapons might have to be used if the conflict widened. In his own presentations, the battlefield and the grand strategy were essentially one problem. For Truman and his advisors, that approach risked turning a limited war on a peninsula into the starting point of a Third World War. For the Joint Chiefs of Staff and many civilians, all of this sat inside a longer story they already knew about MacArthur's career. They remembered that in 1932 he had sent troops across the Anacostia River to clear the bonus army encampments, and that the main camp was destroyed by fire, while some officials later said they had intended a narrower operation. They had seen how in occupied Japan he sometimes dealt directly with Japanese leaders and foreign journalists in ways that seemed to bypass Washington. Now, during the Korean War, they watched him begin to challenge administration policy in public. He sent a message to the veterans of foreign wars that many in Washington read as a swipe at what they saw as appeasement. And he wrote to House Minority Leader Joseph Martin in a way that openly contradicted Truman's limited war line. Martin read that letter on the floor of Congress in early April 1951. To Truman, it began to look as if there were two foreign policies in play, one from the White House and one from his most famous general. To the Joint Chiefs, it suggested a commander who appeared to treat his own judgment as superior to that of elected leaders. On April 10, 1951, after several days of discussion, Truman met again with his senior advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley, to settle the question. The Joint Chiefs later stressed that they had concurred in the decision rather than formally initiating it. But in Truman's diary, he recorded that, in his view, all agreed MacArthur should be relieved. The plan was to handle the change with at least some ceremony. Orders removing MacArthur and naming General Matthew Ridgway as his successor would be signed in Washington, then carried to Tokyo by Secretary of the Army Frank Pace, who was already visiting the Korean front. Formal notification in Tokyo was scheduled for 10 in the morning local time on April 12, 1951. Communications problems in the theater upset that schedule. Pace did not receive the signal that he was to deliver the news. In Washington, rumors began to circulate, and reporters pressed the White House to confirm whether the general was about to be removed. Truman finally decided he could not wait for a perfectly timed handoff on the far side of the Pacific. On the evening of April 11, 1951, Washington time, he released a public statement announcing that MacArthur had been relieved of his Far East commands, expressing regret and explaining that the general could not be relied on to support United States and United Nations policy. That announcement went straight to the press and out over American radio networks. In Tokyo, ordinary radio bulletins moved faster than secure cables. So MacArthur first heard that he had been relieved from a news broadcast before the formal order signed in Washington reached his headquarters. Even many who supported the decision later acknowledged that the way he learned of it, through a commercial, broadcast after more than 50 years of service, was a blunt ending to a long career. Accounts from people who were there agree on one point. MacArthur did not react with an outburst. There were no reported scenes of shouting or smashed glasses. Family members later recalled him turning quietly to his wife Jean and saying that at last they were going home. When the official message finally arrived, he sent back a brief formal acknowledgement confirming that he had received the order and would comply at once. Contemporaries remembered that reply as strikingly direct and obedient, with no legal protest, no demand for a court-martial, and no hint of resistance. For a man widely seen as proud and stubborn, that choice stood out. By accepting the dismissal without public defiance, he made sure the first clear story was not about a general refusing a president. It was about a president removing one of the most celebrated officers in American history. The constitutional crisis some people had feared, with a general openly disobeying a presidential order, did not happen. The argument over strategy and authority shifted from the Far East back to domestic politics in the United States. In the United States, the public reaction was loud and divided. Even before the firing, polls already showed Truman struggling with low approval ratings during a grinding and inconclusive war in Korea. Over the following year, his Gallup numbers slid into the low 20s, which remains among the lowest figures ever recorded for a sitting president. Millions of Americans saw MacArthur as the hero of the Pacific War and the man who had overseen the stabilization of Japan, now dismissed by a president they disliked. Letters and telegrams poured into the White House. Some state legislatures passed resolutions condemning the decision. In several places, flags were lowered to half-mast in protest. Republican leaders denounced the move. Senator Joseph McCarthy mocked Truman in personal terms, painting a picture of the president making the decision late at night with a glass of bourbon and Benedictine in hand. Other conservatives spoke openly about impeachment and accused Truman of weakening the war effort by removing its most famous commander. There was genuine anger, especially among opponents of the administration, but it was not the only response to what had happened. In Japan, the news landed in a very different way. For 6 years, MacArthur had been the face of the occupation, the tall American who stood beside a nervous emperor. Hirohito in the famous photograph from 1945, and the figure Japanese newspapers often depicted in almost royal caricatures. He had overseen land reform, weakened the old militarist elite, and protected the emperor from prosecution while insisting that Hirohito make a public statement accepting responsibility for the war. When his dismissal was announced, editorial writers in Japan described it as the end of an era. Commentators who had grown up under the imperial system wrote about the strange situation in which the foreign general who defeated them had also been the one who, in their view, had shielded the country from harsher Allied demands. On April 16, 1951, as MacArthur left Tokyo by air, large crowds lined the roads to Haneda Airport. Reports from the time described some people weeping and others bowing as his car went past. For many Japanese who had lived through defeat, hunger, and rapid change under his orders, the man who had overseen that transition was departing not as a conqueror marching away, but as a kind of guardian whose role had ended. The same departure that stirred outrage in parts of the United States produced something closer to public mourning in Tokyo. From Tokyo, MacArthur's plane flew to Hawaii and then on to San Francisco. At each stop, crowds came out to see him. In San Francisco, contemporary reports put the turnout along the route at roughly 500,000 people, an unusually large weekday crowd. In New York, a few days later, the welcome was reported as even larger. A ticker tape parade down Fifth Avenue produced one of the city's most cited crowd estimates, with local officials and later writers speaking of about 7.5 million people lining the streets, a number many historians now see as high but still useful as a measure of the scale. Signs along the route praised MacArthur by name and invoked blessings on him, while other placards attacked Truman directly, calling for his removal or treating the day as a public rebuke of the administration. Through all of this, MacArthur said relatively little in public. He issued short, formal thanks to the crowds, but held back from giving a detailed account of his side of the dispute. That restraint helped build anticipation for the speech everyone expected him to give in Washington. On April 19, 1951, MacArthur entered the House chamber of the United States Capitol to address a joint session of Congress. It was his first visit to the continental United States since the late 1930s. In the galleries and on the floor were senators, representatives, Supreme Court justices, cabinet officials, and senior military officers, while millions more followed on radio and on what was still a fairly new medium, television. Dean Acheson and George Marshall did not attend, which observers at the time read as a clear sign that some in the administration did not wish to be part of the applause. MacArthur spoke for a little over half an hour. The written transcript shows a deliberate balance. He defended his record in Korea and explained the reasoning behind his preferred strategy, arguing that once the country was at war, the goal should be clear victory rather than an open-ended stalemate. He used a line that later became one of the most quoted parts of the speech, saying in effect that in war there is no substitute for victory. At the same time, he largely avoided naming Truman. His criticisms were framed as attacks on policies and strategies, not on the president's personal character, which allowed listeners to form their own judgments about who had been right without hearing a five-star general openly denounce his civilian commander. The emotional peak came in the final minutes. MacArthur talked about his 52 years of service, from West Point through 2 world wars to the cold hills of Korea, and he drew on an old soldier's song to describe the way veterans fade from public life. He ended with the line about old soldiers never really dying, but fading away, a phrase that quickly became the best remembered part of his farewell. The chamber responded with repeated standing ovations. Accounts written at the time describe members wiping away tears and applause that went on for several minutes. For many people watching or listening, the moment felt less like a technical debate over strategy and more like a public farewell to a national military figure. In the weeks that followed, MacArthur traveled around the country and drew on that reaction. He spoke in major cities, rode in motorcades, and appeared at rallies. In New York, Chicago, and other large centers, crowds in the hundreds of thousands were reported. The New York ticker tape parade, in particular, became a reference point for later comparisons about crowd size. Commentators began to ask whether this was the start of a presidential run. Some Republicans who opposed Truman and were not yet settled on a preferred candidate talked about the idea of drafting MacArthur as their nominee for 1952. He was in his early 70s, but his name still carried great weight with many voters. In these speeches, MacArthur tended to repeat 3 main themes. He defended his stance on Korea. He argued that communism in Asia posed a grave threat that could not be handled with what he saw as limited measures. And he implied that political caution in Washington had restricted what commanders could do in the field. He did not, however, publicly label the president a coward or openly accuse him of deliberate betrayal, leaving the sharpest personal attacks to supporters at rallies and on the radio. He kept to a tone of injured duty and strategic disagreement. For a time, that combination worked. Opinion polls and headlines presented MacArthur as a man who had been treated unfairly and who might now carry his case, and possibly his candidacy, into the next election cycle. At the same time that the parades and speeches were going on, another process in Washington began to change how many Americans understood the dispute. The Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee opened a joint inquiry into both the conduct of the Korean War and the circumstances of MacArthur's removal. MacArthur testified first. He set out his strategy, his belief in carrying the war to Chinese bases, and his conviction that a broader campaign could still produce a decisive victory. Then, the Joint Chiefs of Staff appeared. Their testimony carried particular weight because they were not elected officials. They were other generals and admirals who had commanded major forces in the Second World War. They presented a very different strategic picture. They argued that Europe remained the central theater, that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was still fragile, that United States forces were already stretched, and that the Soviet Union, unlike China, possessed a significant nuclear arsenal. In their view, if the war in Korea widened into a full-scale conflict with China, American resources would be pulled into Asia, and Western Europe could be left exposed. Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, summed up this concern with a phrase that stayed with the public: warning that expanding the war in the way MacArthur proposed would risk putting the United States into the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time against the wrong enemy. The joint report that followed concluded that Truman's decision to remove MacArthur fell within the constitutional powers of the president and described the circumstances as a shock to national pride. It also underlined the need for an apolitical military and for clear civilian authority even over the most famous commanders. Over time, that combination of testimony and findings began to shift opinion in Washington and in parts of the country. As 1951 moved into 1952, the intensity of MacArthur's public reception started to ease. Crowds at some of his later appearances were smaller, and reporters who had first concentrated on the drama of his dismissal began to press him more on the practical implications of his proposals, including blockades that might affect British-controlled ports, bombing operations close to Soviet territory, and any possible use of nuclear weapons in Asia with all the risks that would carry. By the time Republicans met for their convention in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, not MacArthur, was clearly the front-runner for the nomination. MacArthur did give the keynote address. It was long and formal, and many contemporary accounts describe it as poorly received, with delegates eager to move on to the business of nominating the general who had led Allied forces in Europe. The period when a dismissed commander might realistically have turned into a presidential nominee came and went. MacArthur took a position as chairman of the board of Remington. Rand worked on his memoirs, and from time to time offered private advice to later presidents, but he never again held a public office or a military command. Looking back, historians do not agree on every point. Some Cold War hawks and Asia-focused scholars have argued that MacArthur recognized earlier than most how important the Pacific and East Asia would become in the struggle with communism, and that his desire to confront Chinese power more directly reflected that long-range view. Others stress the dangers involved in widening the Korean War at a time when the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, United States ground forces were thinly spread, and a larger conflict could have forced Washington to choose between commitments in Asia and the security of allies in Europe. From that point of view, the limited war policy, however frustrating, appears as the least risky of several bad options. What is not really contested is that the MacArthur case has become a standard example in American war colleges and civil military courses of what can happen when a popular commander's public advocacy collides with a president's responsibility to manage global risks. If we come back to the question of what MacArthur actually said around the moment he was fired, the record is relatively simple. In Tokyo, at the embassy luncheon, where he first heard the radio report, family members later recalled him turning to his wife Jean and making a quiet remark about finally going home, which they took as weary acceptance after years overseas rather than open fury. When the official dismissal order reached his headquarters, his first formal response was a brief acknowledgement that he had received the president's message and would carry it out at once. 8 days later, in the House chamber, he spoke at length. As we have seen, the prepared text had him tell the country that in war, the goal should be clear victory rather than stalemate, and he described himself using the image of an old soldier gradually fading from public life, borrowing language from a soldier's song that his audience would have recognized. Commentators at the time said those lines, delivered at the end of his address, gave his departure the feel of a national farewell. For a few months, that language helped turn the dismissal in the public mind into something close to martyrdom, and made the loss of command look like a kind of symbolic victory. In the longer run, though, it was not the phrases in Congress that shaped how the episode was judged. It was the fact that an American general had publicly challenged civilian policy and had tried, through speeches and letters, to argue for a different foreign policy while still in uniform. The Senate inquiry, the testimony of the Joint Chiefs, and the absence of any attempt by MacArthur to disobey the final order all pointed back to the same principle, that in the United States, no matter how famous a commander becomes, final authority over war and peace lies with elected leaders. MacArthur's parting words did not erase the rest of his record. They did, however, force the country to think more directly about how far a general can go in open disagreement before a president must act. He did not, in reality, simply disappear from the story. His campaigns in the Pacific, his role in occupied Japan, his clash with Truman over Korea, and his farewell on Capitol Hill continue to appear in debates about limited wars, military dissent, and civilian control. And that first formal reply after his dismissal, a reply that accepted the order, still sits at the center of how the case is taught. The broader argument over the boundary between public disagreement and insubordination in wartime has never completely gone away.